Imagine a world of towering castles, armored knights, candlelit monasteries. All of that is true, but the fog of myths created by Hollywood, the Renaissance, and the 19th century is so thick that most people can't see the real truth hiding behind it. A world they taught us to call ignorant, filthy, and brutal. But what if I told you that almost everything you learned about the Middle Ages is completely wrong? What if you discovered that medieval scholars already knew the Earth was round centuries before Columbus was even born? People bathed, used perfumes, and some cities had more public baths than many modern capitals. Universities, scientific debates, architectural revolutions, and literary masterpieces flourished during the time we call the Dark Ages. And what about the Inquisition, the witches, the torture chambers, the chastity belts? The truth is, most of these horrors were invented hundreds of years later to sell books, propaganda, and sensationalism. If you click away from this video right now, you will continue believing the lie. But if you stick around, we are going to dismantle the 6 greatest myths about the Middle Ages. Not with fantasy, but with facts so surprising they will change the way you see an entire era. Stay with me. This is your passport to the truth behind the Middle Ages. The Flat Earth Myth. What medieval people really believed. If there is one myth that refuses to die, it is the idea that medieval people believed the Earth was flat. Ask anyone on the street and they'll tell you, back in the Middle Ages, everyone thought you'd sail off the edge of the world. But the truth couldn't be further from that modern fantasy. In fact, for a medieval scholar, the idea of a flat Earth would have sounded as ridiculous as believing the sky was made of paper. Let's start with the basics. Medieval academics knew the Earth was round. Not guessed, not suspected, knew. How? Because they read the works of ancient thinkers like Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Macrobius, all of whom argued for a spherical Earth. Medieval education didn't erase ancient knowledge, it preserved it. One of the most important books of the Middle Ages, used in virtually every European university, was Liber de Sphæra, written in the 13th century by the English scholar Jean de Sacrobosco. This text explicitly describes Earth as a sphere and even explains lunar eclipses, seasonal changes, and why ships disappear over the horizon. Students in Paris, Oxford, and Bologna all learned from it. Even medieval theologians knew the world was round. St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the biggest intellectuals of the entire medieval period, referenced the spherical Earth as an accepted fact. He wasn't debating it, he was using it to explain other concepts. To medieval thinkers, the round Earth wasn't a question of faith, it was simply science. So how did the flat Earth myth even begin? Here's the twist. It didn't come from the Middle Ages at all. It came centuries later, mostly from the 19th century, when certain writers wanted to paint the medieval period as ignorant, superstitious, and anti-science. Authors like Washington Irving and John William Draper published popular books claiming that the church had opposed the idea of a round Earth and that medieval thinkers believed the world was a disc. These writers weren't historians. They were storytellers, and not very careful ones. Their goal wasn't accuracy, it was ideology. They wanted to promote the idea that religion had been an enemy of science, so they invented a Middle Ages filled with flat earthers, witch burnings, and ignorant monks. And unfortunately, their narratives became embedded in school textbooks, especially in the United States and Europe, during the 19th and 20th centuries. But if you ask real medievalists, modern historians who specialize in the Middle Ages, they'll tell you the truth. No serious medieval scholar believed in a flat Earth. Travelers, sailors, merchants, astronomers, geographers, they all operated under the assumption of a globe. The very maps used for navigation, including the famous T&O maps, weren't literal drawings of the Earth's shape. They were symbolic diagrams of the known world, not scientific projections. When Columbus proposed reaching Asia by sailing west, no one said, "You'll fall off the edge." They said, "Your calculations are wrong. Asia is too far." They were correct. Columbus was lucky North America got in the way. It's important to understand why this myth survived so strongly, because it's useful. It makes the present feel superior to the past. It paints our ancestors as fools so we can pretend we're smarter. But in reality, medieval scholars were incredibly sophisticated, well-read, and connected to a long tradition of scientific thought. They debated astronomy, mapped stars, corrected earlier calculations, and even developed complex models of the heavens. Monasteries copied scientific texts for centuries, ensuring that ancient Greek knowledge survived into the Renaissance. Without the Middle Ages, much of classical science would have been lost forever. So the next time someone says medieval people believed the earth was flat, you'll know the truth. This is not a medieval idea. It's a modern lie, one invented long after the Middle Ages were over. And now that we've dismantled the first great myth, let's move on to one of the most persistent stereotypes of all, the belief that medieval people were filthy, smelly, and never took a bath. They never bathed. The medieval hygiene myth. If Hollywood were accurate, every medieval village would smell like a mix of smoke, mud, horses, and human misery. Movies love to show peasants covered in dirt, nobles rotting behind layers of velvet, and entire cities living in filth. But this image says much more about modern imagination than it does about the actual Middle Ages. In reality, medieval people cared deeply about hygiene, far more than most people today imagine. Let's start with something surprising. Europe in the Middle Ages had public bathhouses. Not one or two, hundreds. Paris alone had dozens of them. London, Cologne, Florence, Porto, and Lisbon all had public bathing spaces where people washed, shaved, relaxed, and socialized. Archaeological records confirm pools, heating systems, tubs, and even early saunas. Bathing wasn't just a luxury of the wealthy, it was part of urban life. People often visited bathhouses weekly, some even daily. Think of them as a mix between a modern spa and a social club. And then there were the monasteries, centers of order, study, and surprisingly, cleanliness. Monastic rules required regular washing. Monks washed their hands before meals, washed visitors' feet as an act of hospitality, and bathed on specific days of the week. Some monastic communities even had hot water, diverted through stone channels. The idea that medieval people never brushed their teeth is also incorrect. They used mixtures of crushed herbs, mint, rosemary, cloves, vinegar, and even charcoal to freshen breath and clean teeth. Women used perfumes and ointments made from lavender, rosewater, and sage. Medieval medical texts describe recipes for deodorants and soaps, usually made from animal fat and ash, sometimes scented with herbs. Clothing was washed far more often than most people expect. Peasants, who owned fewer garments, washed them regularly in rivers. Nobles changed linen shirts and undergarments frequently, sometimes daily, because linen absorbs sweat and was considered essential for cleanliness. So where did this filthy reputation come from? A combination of factors, some medieval, some much later. The first major blow to medieval hygiene came with the arrival of the Black Death in the mid-14th century. People grew terrified that water opened the pores and allowed in bad air, the medieval explanation for disease. So after 1350, bathing became less frequent in some regions. This wasn't due to ignorance, but fear. It's the same way people reacted during modern pandemics, avoiding certain habits until they understood the risks. But the biggest distortion came from the Renaissance and the 19th century. Renaissance writers wanted to glorify their era, so they painted the Middle Ages as dirty, chaotic, and barbaric. Then in the 1800s, Victorian writers, who themselves avoided bathing out of fear of waterborne disease, projected their own aversion onto medieval people. The irony: medieval Europeans probably bathed more often than most Victorians did. Even more surprising, medieval Islamic cities, like Cordoba and Baghdad, had entire districts dedicated to public baths, and Europeans admired their hygiene. Cultural exchanges during the Crusades further influenced European bathing customs. The truth is simple: people in the Middle Ages valued hygiene. Not with antibacterial soap and designer shampoos, of course, but with the tools they had, and often with impressive frequency. So why does the myth persist? Because a dirty Middle Ages makes for good storytelling. Filthy peasants and grimy knights are dramatic, cinematic, and easy for audiences to accept. But actual history is far more human and far more nuanced. The Middle Ages were not a paradise of perfect cleanliness. Cities had waste problems, sewage systems were primitive, and epidemics were real. But that doesn't mean people gave up on hygiene. They adapted, they washed, they cared. The next time someone claims medieval people never bathed, you can tell them the truth. People in the Middle Ages cleaned themselves with the same determination they used to survive, regularly, creatively, and far more often than modern stereotypes suggest. And now that we've washed away one myth, it's time to confront one of the most misleading labels in all of history: the idea that the Middle Ages were a cultural and scientific dark age. The Dark Ages: culture, universities, and science. No phrase has damaged the reputation of the Middle Ages more than the term the Dark Ages. It's a label that conjures images of ignorance, superstition, and intellectual stagnation, as if Europe had turned off the lights for 1,000 years and waited for the Renaissance to switch them back on. But this image, repeated endlessly in movies, memes, and school textbooks, has almost nothing to do with what actually happened. Let's begin with a shocking truth. The Middle Ages invented the university, not the Renaissance, not the Enlightenment. The very idea of organized higher education, with faculties, degrees, exams, and research, was born in medieval Europe. Institutions like Bologna, 1088, Paris, 1150, and Oxford, 1096, trained jurists, doctors, theologians, astronomers, mathematicians, and philosophers. Their libraries preserved and expanded the works of Aristotle, Hippocrates, Galen, and countless others. The medieval classroom was not a place of silence and obedience. It was noisy, argumentative, and shockingly modern. Students debated logic, analyzed astronomical charts, studied anatomy, and even conducted early forms of scientific observation. Professors wrote textbooks, invented scholastic methods of reasoning, and passed down knowledge that later fueled the Renaissance. So where did the Dark Ages idea come from? From propaganda. Renaissance humanists, eager to elevate their own achievements, invented the concept. They portrayed themselves as the brilliant heirs of Greece and Rome, shining light into the darkness of medieval thought. To make themselves look brighter, they made the Middle Ages look darker. Then, centuries later, Enlightenment writers, Voltaire, Gibbon, and their circle, doubled down on this image. They viewed religion as the enemy of reason and exaggerated medieval superstition to promote their worldview. The Middle Ages became a convenient villain, blamed for everything from ignorance to disease. But modern historians have dismantled this caricature. Far from being intellectually stagnant, the medieval world was bursting with innovation. Consider architecture. The Gothic cathedrals, Notre Dame, Chartres, Reims, were engineering miracles. Flying buttresses, pointed arches, and ribbed vaults allowed buildings to reach heights unmatched anywhere else on Earth. These cathedrals were the skyscrapers of their time, feats of mathematics, geometry, and artistic vision. Medicine also advanced. Medieval doctors wrote encyclopedias of herbal knowledge, studied anatomy, and translated Arabic medical texts into Latin. Hospitals existed across Europe, often run by religious orders dedicated to caring for the sick, centuries before modern public health care. In astronomy, scholars used astrolabes, calculated planetary movements, and refined the geocentric model inherited from antiquity, even though they would later be proven wrong. The University of Paris had entire faculties dedicated to the study of the heavens, and monks meticulously recorded eclipses, comets, climate patterns, and astronomical anomalies. Culturally, the Middle Ages were anything but barren. Epic poetry, from the Song of Roland to Beowulf. Illuminated manuscripts, hand-painted with gold, lapis lazuli, and intricate symbolism. Music, Gregorian chant, medieval polyphony, courtly songs, troubadour poetry, festivals, theatre, street performances, carnivals. Europe was as lively and expressive as any modern society. So why do people still think it was all darkness? Because the myth is simple, and simple myths spread faster than complex truths. The truth is that the Middle Ages were a bridge, not a void, a 1,000-year laboratory where old knowledge was preserved and new knowledge was created. Without medieval scholars copying manuscripts, the works of Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, and Cicero might have vanished forever. Without medieval builders, the architectural innovations of the Renaissance would have been impossible. Without medieval universities, there would be no scientific revolution. The lights of the Middle Ages were never off. They were burning in monasteries, universities, workshops, libraries, and cathedrals across Europe, growing brighter with every century. And now that we've shattered the lie of the Dark Ages, let's turn to one of the most sensational myths of all: torture, witch hunts, and the terrifying reputation of the medieval Inquisition. Inquisition, witches, and torture. What really happened? Few parts of medieval history are more surrounded by fear, fantasy, and exaggeration than the Inquisition. Ask the average person, and they'll describe iron maidens, witch burnings, racks, dungeons, and priests obsessed with torture. Hollywood turned the medieval church into a horror movie, and Victorian writers did the rest. But if we strip away the myths and look at what historians actually know, the truth is far stranger and far less bloody than the legends. First, let's clarify something essential. Most of the infamous torture devices associated with the Middle Ages never existed at the time. The Iron Maiden, a 19th century museum hoax. The Pear of Anguish, probably a Renaissance invention, exaggerated later. The breaking wheel, rare in medieval courts and far more common in early modern secular punishments. Nearly every medieval torture museum is filled with objects created centuries after the Middle Ages ended. So if these weren't medieval, where did they come from? Much of the imagery comes from the 19th century, when Europe developed a fascination with the barbaric past. This was the era of sensational journalism, traveling freak shows, and fascination with gore. Writers exaggerated or fabricated torture devices to shock audiences and to paint the Middle Ages as an era of pure barbarism. But what about the Inquisition itself? Here again, the stereotype falls apart under scrutiny. The medieval Inquisition, especially in its early centuries, was far more bureaucratic than brutal. Its primary goal was not to punish, but to correct. Medieval society valued unity of belief, and heresy was seen as a danger to the community, but the Church's first solution was reconciliation, not violence. Trials were methodical. Investigators collected testimonies. Accused individuals were questioned in public, with the opportunity to repent. And the majority of sentences were surprisingly light: small fines, public penances, short periods of imprisonment, acts of charity, or simple warnings. Execution was rare and typically handled by secular authorities, not the Church. Now let's address the myth of medieval witch hunts, one of the most misunderstood topics in history. The truth is that the Middle Ages saw very few witch trials. The large-scale witch hunts that killed tens of thousands of people occurred between the 15th and 17th centuries, during the early modern period, not the medieval one. Even the infamous Inquisition in Spain burned fewer than a dozen people for witchcraft across its entire existence. Most accusations of witchcraft were dismissed as superstition. What about torture? Yes, torture did exist, but with strict limits. By law, it could only be used when there was already strong evidence for a short duration and without causing permanent injury or death. These restrictions were often more humane than punishments conducted by secular courts, which could be far more violent. In many medieval regions, civil courts executed criminals by hanging, drowning, or burning without hesitation, while inquisitors often insisted on leniency. Why then do we imagine the Middle Ages as a nightmare of torture chambers? Because the narrative was shaped by political and ideological battles. Protestant writers in the 16th century painted the Catholic Church as monstrous. Enlightenment thinkers in the 18th century portrayed the entire medieval world as cruel and irrational. Victorians added gore for entertainment. By the 20th century, the image was set, and Hollywood took it from there. Modern historians, studying archival documents, have dismantled this entire mythology. The reality is that the medieval Inquisition was a legal institution, flawed and imperfect, but far more administrative than brutal. And the terrifying devices we see in pop culture were mostly inventions of later centuries. This doesn't mean the Middle Ages were peaceful or gentle, but it does mean the popular image is fiction, not fact. Now that we've cleared the smoke from the torture chambers, it's time to confront another set of cinematic myths. Knights, chastity belts, and prima nocte, myths that never existed. Few images of the Middle Ages are as iconic, or as completely wrong, as the idea of knights enforcing the right of the first night, or noblewomen locked into iron chastity belts. These stories are repeated endlessly in movies, memes, and even some textbooks, but historically, they fall apart the moment you look at real medieval evidence. Let's start with the most sensational myth of all, prima nocte, also known as droit du seigneur, the supposed right of a feudal lord to sleep with a peasant bride on her wedding night. It's a shocking story. It's cinematic, and it's completely fictional. There is not a single medieval document, law code, royal decree, church ruling, or court case that mentions this practice as something real. Not one. Historians have searched archives across Europe, France, England, Scotland, Italy, Germany, and found zero evidence. The earliest references to prima nocte appear in medieval comedies and satirical poems, not legal documents. Writers used it as a joke, a metaphor, or a criticism of immoral lords, never as a description of real life. So how did people start believing it was real? Blame the 19th century once again. Romantic writers, political radicals, and anti-clerical authors used the legend to paint feudalism as barbaric and oppressive. It became a powerful political tool. If the Middle Ages were this cruel, then everything modern must be better. But medieval historians today agree, prima nocte never existed. Now let's talk about the second legend, chastity belts. The iron contraption supposedly locked around a woman's waist to ensure she stayed faithful while her husband went on crusade. You've seen them in museums and movies, sometimes even in cartoons. But here's the truth. Nearly all known chastity belts are from the 16th to 19th centuries, not the Middle Ages. Many were created as curiosities, jokes, or even Victorian-era sexual fetish items, later mislabeled as authentic medieval artifacts. Some were fabricated entirely for exhibitions to shock audiences. Real medieval texts mention chastity, but always as a moral or spiritual virtue, not a metal device. No medieval woman walked around with a locked iron cage under her dress. It would have been impractical, painful, unsanitary, and impossible to conceal. So if these myths are false, what were knights and noblewomen actually like? For one, knights followed an elaborate code of chivalry, a moral framework rooted in Christian virtue, honor, and service. Was it always practiced perfectly? Of course not. Knights were human. Some were violent, greedy, and brutal, especially during wartime. But the ideal of chivalry was real. Knights were expected to protect the weak, respect women, and serve God and their Lord honorably. Medieval romances and epics, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, The Song of Roland, Parzival, show knights wrestling with moral choices, loyalty, courage, and humility. These stories shaped the cultural imagination of Europe and inspired real social expectations. Women, too, had far more agency than the myths suggest. They owned property, managed estates, arranged marriages, testified in court, and in some regions could inherit titles. Noblewomen supervised entire households, negotiated alliances, and even led troops in emergencies. They were not passive prisoners locked behind iron belts. So why do these myths survive? Because they are sensational. A Middle Ages filled with barbaric rites, perverse torture devices, and oppressed women is far more exciting and marketable than the complex reality. The real medieval world was structured, moralistic, often strict, but not the bizarre nightmare created by modern imagination. The truth is far more human and far more interesting. Knights struggled with honor. Women navigated power in clever ways. Society balanced faith, duty, and survival. No iron cages, no wedding night horrors, just people living their lives within a system that was imperfect but not monstrous. And speaking of misconceptions about medieval life, there's one final myth we need to dismantle, one that might be the most touching of all: the idea that medieval parents didn't love their children. Family, childhood, and love in the Middle Ages. If you search the internet for medieval childhood, you'll find a flood of grim statements. Children were treated like small adults. Parents didn't love their kids. Life was so harsh that emotional bonds didn't exist. These are powerful ideas, but like so many myths about the Middle Ages, they collapse when confronted with real historical evidence. The truth is simple and far more human. Medieval parents loved their children deeply. They grieved their deaths, celebrated their births, protected them, taught them, and worried about them, just like parents today. They simply expressed that love within the realities of a world where danger, disease, and hard labor were woven into everyday life. Let's begin with the myth that children were treated as mini-adults. This idea came from 20th century historians who misinterpreted medieval art. In religious paintings, artists often depicted children, especially Jesus, with adult proportions. But this wasn't realism. It was symbolic style. Medieval painters wanted to emphasize divinity or wisdom, not physical accuracy. Documents from the period tell a different story. Letters, legal texts, and manuals of household management show that medieval families recognized stages of childhood, each with specific expectations, protections, and responsibilities. Young children played with toys, wooden knights, dolls, whistles. They were nursed, rocked to sleep, and comforted during illness. Parental affection is visible everywhere, in wills where parents leave special gifts to specific children, in letters showing concern for education or health. in funeral records describing mothers fainting or screaming over the loss of a child. Yes, medieval childhood was dangerous, mortality rates were high, and work began early. But that didn't make parents indifferent. If anything, it made their attachments stronger. Medieval mothers breastfed their children, often for 2 years or more, following medical advice of the time. Texts from monastic scholars discuss the best ways to raise children with gentleness and discipline. Noble families hired tutors and wet nurses, but they still emphasized moral education, religious upbringing, and emotional closeness. Fathers weren't absent either. Contrary to the stereotype of the distant medieval patriarch, many fathers were active caregivers. They taught skills, supervised apprenticeships, mediated disputes, and took pride in their children's achievements. In some regions, fathers were legally responsible for the emotional and physical well-being of their children, something rarely emphasized in popular narratives. Children also had social value beyond labor. They were seen as blessings, symbols of lineage and carriers of family memory. Baptism celebrations, feast days, and local festivals placed children at the center of communal life. In Germanic and later Christian tradition, harming a child was one of the most severe moral offenses a person could commit. But where did the myth of loveless medieval families come from? Part of it comes from modern projection. When modern people learn that medieval children began helping with work early, they assume it reflects a lack of affection. But in a world where every hand was needed to survive, on farms, in workshops, in markets, work was a way of integrating children into society, not a sign of neglect. Another source of confusion came from early modern Europe, 16th, 18th centuries, where attitudes toward children changed, leading later writers to assume medieval families were the same. In reality, medieval texts show far more tenderness than people expect. Historians studying legal cases, parish records, personal letters, and burial practices now agree. Medieval families were emotionally invested in their children. They mourned deeply when they died. They protected them fiercely, and they expressed love in ways shaped by the dangers and rhythms of their time. The myth survives because it fits the broader narrative of a cruel Middle Ages, a time supposedly filled with coldness and brutality. But the real medieval world was filled with ordinary human emotions: tenderness, fear, pride, joy, grief. Children laughed, played, learned, and grew. Parents worried, prayed, taught, and loved. Behind the armor, the churches, and the plagues, there were families, just like ours, holding on to each other through a world that was harsh, uncertain, and profoundly human. And with this final myth revealed, we've reached the end of our journey. For centuries, the Middle Ages have lived in the shadows of myth: flat earth, filthy peasants, ignorant scholars, torture chambers, oppressed women, loveless families. But as we've seen tonight, the truth is far more complex and far more human. This was not a 1,000-year darkness, but a vibrant, evolving world, a world where universities were born, where science and faith debated side by side, where architecture reached for the heavens, and where ordinary people lived with dignity, resilience, and creativity. It was a world of imperfections, yes, but also of innovation, of families who cared, of communities that bathed, studied, healed, worked, and dreamed. The myths that surround the Middle Ages say more about us than about them. We inherited stories shaped by politics, propaganda, and centuries of exaggeration, and forgot to look at the real people who lived through that time. History is never simple, and the more we uncover, the more we realize how much we owe to those medieval generations who preserved knowledge, built institutions, and shaped the foundations of our modern world. If you enjoyed this journey into the truth behind the Middle Ages, make sure to subscribe to Medieval Crazy History and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from and which myth surprised you the most, because the past is full of surprises, and here we bring it back to life.